this video, I am talking about a topic that has been a mystery for humans across centuries. It's one of the oldest diseases known to man, and in recorded history, it has always been noted as a problem or a thorn in the side of men. In fact, one of our very famous fathers in South Africa stated this about this disease: "The world has made defeating AIDS a top priority. This is a blessing, but TB remains ignored." The topic we're going to talk about in this video is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, known to all of us as TB. In the 1990s, TB had become such a huge problem, not just in South Africa, but in the world. The World Health Organization declared TB a pandemic of momentous proportions that we had to do something about. Unfortunately, South Africa in 2006 was declared the country with the highest prevalence of TB. And this has not really changed over the last 10 years. Despite very good treatment programs for TB, because of a huge divide between higher economic groups and lower economic groups, as well as our HIV burden, as well as our distribution of equal healthcare or unequal healthcare, TB has always been a problem for South Africa. And while we're year on year not the top leading country, we always remain in the top 3. So when you underwrite or do claims assessment in South Africa, TB is going to be one of those diseases you will see on applications. So how is TB spread? Well, TB is spread by droplet infection. What do we mean by that? Every time we cough or we exhale, and when we speak, there are these microscopic droplets that we do not see in the air. So in fact, if I pass you and I have TB, if you do not have a good immune system, you may acquire TB just in passing. So through coughing, through sneezing, through talking, I can pass on TB. It can be inhaled by another person, and these infectious particles reach the alveoli. The good news is that if you have a healthy immune system, you should not get TB. You're usually resistant to TB, coupled with your vaccinations or your immunizations you had as a child should make you fairly resistant to TB. And here's the thing, we only diagnose TB when we clinically detect TB in the person, which means you may have had latent TB or TB just sitting there and your immune is keeping it under control. We only diagnose the disease if you have symptoms of TB. The organism is usually walled off in an inflammatory process in the alveoli called a granuloma, and there it can sit for months or years before the body clears it away. Before we start on what the signs and symptoms of TB are, we do need to look at 4 terms that is often used in medical reports about TB. Primary tuberculosis. By that we mean your first exposure to TB and your first exposure where you have clinical symptoms. Otherwise, we would not have called this primary TB. Then there's pulmonary TB. It actually is secondary TB because we are not referring to your first exposure here, but we commonly call it pulmonary TB or in literature or in reports as PTB. Then there's miliary TB. In a small proportion of people, TB becomes very rampant. And even though this disease is usually very slow and infectious, in miliary TB, it acts like a flu virus or one of those viruses that are very aggressive and moves very fast throughout the body. And miliary TB usually has a poor prognosis. And then there's this concept called extrapulmonary TB. 100 years ago, extrapulmonary TB was far more common. And it is exactly as the name implies, TB that is found in the body causing disease that does not sit in the lungs. So this TB is found either in your brain, in the GIT, somewhere else in the body that is not the lungs. So what are the signs and symptoms of pulmonary TB? In primary TB, the science is around the body's response to this organism they recognize as a foreign organism in the body, and also the target organ, which is the lungs. So in primary TB, the hallmarks is loss of appetite, loss of weight, and one of the hallmarks of the systemic inflammation or response is drenching night sweats. Why is there night sweats in TB? We're not sure compared to influenza or any of the other infectious diseases, but it is a hallmark of TB. And then when it comes to the lungs, usually not classically a productive cough, but in primary TB it's usually a dry cough, because this TB germ hasn't yet caused this infection that we see in the other TBs, but it has caused an irritation to the lung. The next group that we're going to look at is pulmonary TB, which is established TB. Symptoms are very similar to what we call primary TB. It's the night sweats, the loss of appetite, the GIT symptoms. But unlike the dry cough in primary TB, in pulmonary TB, we have usually a productive cough and more respiratory system. Some people will have chest pain. Some might have inflammation in the lining of their lungs called the pleura, and if they have that, they either have a pleural effusion or something called pleuritis, irritation of the pleura. The next group that we're going to look at is miliary TB. Remember, I told you it's a rapidly aggressive form of TB, and the target organs is usually the lung and the brain. Unlike primary TB and pulmonary TB, where the focus in the lungs is usually one area or two areas, miliary TB looks like cotton wool spots all over the lungs. Some people says it looks like gunshot pellets all over the lungs. You don't have it just confined to one space in the lungs, it's everywhere. The same happens in the brain. And if it's not caught early enough, the prognosis is always poor. Then we're going to look at extrapulmonary TB. Very common sites for extrapulmonary TB is the GIT system, where we often can see TB of the stomach, TB of the colon. It often also affects the bladder. We may pick it up when we test the urine. We can see TB of the brain. You can get a meningitis, TB meningitis. You can get a TB abscess in the brain. And last but not least, TB of the bones and joints. If you have TB of the bones and joints, it's extremely painful, and often people are sent, even now, to sanatoriums to get better. It doesn't just affect the way you're going to take medication, but it does affect mobility, and that is why people are sent for extended periods to hospital to recover from TB of the bones or joints. How do we know it's TB? Well, it involves investigations of somebody who we think has symptoms of TB. We'll always send the sputum or the blood of that person, or perhaps, depending on the circumstances, the urine, away for culture. Under electronic microscope, the TB looks like little rods that you can see. There are also classic signs when we do an X-ray of somebody who has TB of the lungs. TB can cause immense damage over time to the lungs, can cause cavity formation, can cause pneumonias, can cause pleural infusions, can cause hyperinflation of the rest of the lung, where it's struggling now to do gaseous exchange because part of the lung is so damaged. In this X-ray that we see, we have a terribly damaged lung with cavities seen, tracheas pulled to one side because of fibrosis and pathology, and we also see immense hyperinflation of both lung fields. So how do we treat TB? Well, TB is mostly treated with oral medication. But there's a big but. TB can't be treated in a week. Because it's a slow-growing organism, it takes longer to kill it because it needs a longer exposure to medication. And when I say a longer exposure, I mean 6 to 9 months for uncomplicated TB. And this makes compliance a huge challenge all over the world. You can well imagine why people are compliant when they're not feeling well. But as slowly as they start feeling better, they do not feel the need to be taking this medication. After all, I'm feeling fine now. Surely I only needed this short while of TB treatment. The other big challenge to compliance is the side effects of treatment. And the side effects can sometimes be just as harsh as the symptoms of TB for that person. You can get a neuropathy, and the neuropathies are usually painful, that some people even have to use opiates, things like morphine to take away the pain. You can also get liver impairment, you can get visual disturbance and hearing disturbance. Not only that, some of these side effects do not improve after stoppage of the medication. So it is a huge risk people are taking. Unfortunately, without taking it 6 to 9 months, the TB will carry on relentless and you will be infectious in your community. So what are the complications of TB? The first one, which is a huge one for South Africa at the moment, is drug resistance and multi-drug resistance as well. So what that means is that if I only took TB medication for a limited time and I stopped, and there are still some TB organisms sitting in my body, they become quite clever in when next they get exposed to the same drug, how to fight it, because they were the survivors after all. And that is how drug resistance starts. The problem is, not everybody who has multi-drug resistance TB had TB where they were non-compliant. I can then pass on my multi-drug resistant strain to someone else. The other problem with TB is you can get relapse of the disease. So what that means is I was successfully treated 6 to 9 months. Clinically, I do not have TB anymore. But a few years later, my immune system is down because I was fighting some other process in my body. I can then get a recurrence of my TB. Another complications of TB, which is not actually a complication, but more a form of severity, it's biliary TB. And that is a poor prognosis. Because the lungs are damaged, I can end up with respiratory failure. And unfortunately, the mortality rates of TB are still very high in South Africa, far too high. And people are still dying today as a result of TB. So how do we view TB in insurance medicine? Well, the first rule is this: whether it's primary TB or uncomplicated TB, whether this was an athlete who was in the Olympics, we do not give cover to somebody who's still on TB treatment. We wait until they are fully treated and we have assurances from their health professionals that they are clinically now cured of their TB. You also have to underwrite any TB complication. So this person was treated for TB, they are now cured of their TB, but do they have lung damage? Do they have signs of CRAD? Do they have signs of respiratory failure as a result of what damage the TB had caused? We also look more closely at people with extrapulmonary TB involvement. Have that damaged the organ of note, so they've been cured of the TB, but is there joint impairments? There are many people who have TB of the spine who end up with paralysis even though they're cured of TB, and that has to be underwritten like all other paralysis. Unlike the other two diseases, asthma and COPD, where underwriting is far more concerned about it than claims, because we see far more at underwriting stage. When it comes to TB, we'll see far more claims related to TB rather than at underwriting. And what is important with TB and claims? Well, we look at the duration of treatment is often not relevant. And people want to say that 12 to 18 months of TB treatment is unusual, therefore they should be regarded as permanently disabled. Unfortunately, it is a disease that takes long to treat, and therefore 12 months of treatment on TB is not that unusual compared to treatment of something else that we only needed to be for 6 months. So we do view the duration of TB treatment not as relevant as we do in other diseases. The other important point to note is the impairment should be rated, not the TB. So you had respiratory symptoms when you had TB. But are those symptoms permanent? And what is your function of your lungs after you've had your TB treatment. That is very important. We also look at the systemic symptoms, like I've mentioned, the paralysis. That would make a huge difference. But not while you're on TB treatment, after your TB treatment has been completed. And then a very important note, we often see this in group cover and disability cover. Being on TB treatment does not equal inability to work. The important point to note is that once you're 2 weeks on treatment, for all common cases of TB, you're no longer infectious. So there's no need to be off for the entire 6 to 9 months while you're on treatment. So you cannot rate somebody unable to work simply because they're on TB treatment. I hope that helped with some of the challenges we see with regards to TB. It still remains quite a difficult disease to process at underwriting and at claims. And if there's any doubt, we would strongly encourage you to refer those cases to your medical department. I hope this TB video has given you, though, some insight into why we see it commonly and what are the complications with regards to TB in insurance medicine.